The Queen Mother had many official reasons to dislike Wallis Simpson, and they were easy to recite. Wallis was divorced. Wallis was American. Wallis was too sharp, too thin, too modern, too mocking, too close to a weak king at the worst possible moment. But those weren't the real reasons Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon never forgave her. The real reason was more intimate. Wallis didn't simply take Edward VIII away from the throne. She pushed Bertie onto it. She turned a shy, stammering second son into George VI. She turned his wife into queen. She turned their daughters into heirs. And from that moment on, every burden the family carried could be traced, in the Queen Mother's mind, back to one woman in Paris. This isn't the story most people tell. The standard account treats the abdication as a constitutional drama. The church, the government, the dominions, the question of whether a divorced woman could be a British queen. All of that is real, and all of it's documented. But it does not explain why the grudge lasted 50 years, why it calcified into policy, why the woman who had engineered this particular domestic catastrophe was managed, minimized, and excluded, not just from formal royal events, but from the margins of the family she had technically married into. Biographers from William Shawcross, who had access to Elizabeth's own letters and diaries, to Hugo Vickers, whose work investigated the enmity directly, have traced the outline of something simpler and harder. That Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's anger wasn't primarily institutional or moral. It was domestic. It was personal. And it outlasted almost everyone it touched. In 1927, the Duke and Duchess of York settled into 145 Piccadilly, near Hyde Park Corner in London. By the standards of royal life, it was modest, a townhouse rather than a palace, and that modesty was, in a particular way, the point. Elizabeth had already refused the Duke's marriage proposals twice, in 1921 and 1922, reportedly because she feared what membership in the royal family would cost her in terms of personal freedom. Lady Strathmore, her mother, observed that Albert would be made or marred by his choice of wife. After a long courtship, Elizabeth finally agreed, and they married at Westminster Abbey on 26 April 1923. At 145 Piccadilly, they built something that was, by the standards of what surrounded them, close to an ordinary life. Princess Elizabeth arrived in April 1926, Princess Margaret in August 1930. The household ran on what one contemporary account described as orderly and well-oiled lines. Charlotte the cook, the night nursery, the garden backing onto Hyde Park, the daily rhythms that belong to a house rather than to an institution. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon entertained, visited Glamis Castle in Scotland, organized the children's days with the carefulness of someone who understood that small domestic structures held large anxieties at bay. She did charitable work, gave speeches, appeared at public events. The volume of obligation was manageable, the edges of her role visible and defined. There were Sunday mornings in the park. There were evenings that ended at a reasonable hour. There were private conversations in rooms that no one was required to report on. The life at 145 Piccadilly wasn't grand. Visitors arriving at the house in the late 1920s described it almost with surprise, the sense that someone of this rank should live more impressively. But that absence of grandeur was precisely its value. The family lived within walking distance of Hyde Park rather than in a palace, and the difference wasn't merely architectural. Albert was the second son. The Prince of Wales, David to his family, the future Edward VIII, stood between the Yorks and the throne. George V was king. The line of succession pointed past the Duke of York's household almost entirely. The princesses Elizabeth and Margaret would in all likelihood grow up, marry privately, and live as their parents now lived, within sight of power, but not inside it. Elizabeth had married into the orbit of the crown, had accepted what that required, and had shaped her household around the particular demands of a man who needed something quieter than the senior role could offer. What she had was rare for someone in her position. A domestic life that was genuinely hers, built around the specific vulnerabilities of a man she understood completely. The question of what would happen if that private system were suddenly scaled into something national never arose in the early 1930s, because there was no reason it should. Albert Frederick Arthur George wasn't, in any conventional sense, prepared to be king. He had grown up in the shadow of his elder brother and had experienced his childhood as something that required management and endurance. His stammer had been with him since childhood. Biographer John Wheeler Bennett describes its psychological toll in terms that go well beyond inconvenience. Before he found Lionel Logue, the Australian speech therapist he began working with in October 1926, specialist after specialist had failed him. Their failures, in Wheeler Bennett's account, had bred within him what he called the inconsolable despair of the chronic stammerer, and the secret dread that the hidden root of the affliction lay in the mind rather than the body. Logue made a consultation card for their first meeting, dated 19 October 1926. Good chest development, strong top lung breathing, but the lower lung and diaphragm entirely unused, a very flabby waistline. The physical observations were clinical and unsparing. Logue's diary, discovered by his grandson Mark Logue decades after his death and published alongside journalist Peter Conradi in 2010, recorded the opening impression more vividly. "He entered my consulting room," Logue wrote, "a slim, quiet man who entered with his shoulder hunched round his bent head. A man trying, by force of posture, to make himself smaller, to reduce the surface area available to sound. The sessions ran at first for an hour a day over several months. Breathing exercises, relaxation techniques, the careful, slow work of rewiring the relationship between thought and sound." Elizabeth attended many of them. She rehearsed speeches with Bertie at home in the evenings, sitting with him in whatever room at 145 Piccadilly happened to be quiet enough, going through the lines that needed to be said in public while the rest of the household continued its evening business around them. She understood, before anyone else at court acknowledged it openly, exactly what public duty demanded of a man who had spent years dreading the sound of his own voice. The improvement was real and documented. By 1927, he opened the new Parliament House in Canberra during a tour of Australia, the words arriving with less obstruction than they once had. By 1938, those who heard his speeches noted genuine progress. Logue continued to advise on every major wartime broadcast, but the stammer never entirely left. It was managed, not cured. Every public appearance carried risk. Every state occasion required preparation that most public figures simply didn't need. Sarah Bradford's biography of George VI was titled The Reluctant King, not as literary flourish, but as biographical judgment. History Extra described him, in an assessment that drew on the full record, as staid, dutiful, hesitant, and insecure. His fits of temper, sudden and disproportionate, triggered by minor mishaps, were documented in Bradford's research as the other face of the anxiety he couldn't otherwise release. He dreaded large audiences, dreaded wireless broadcasts, dreaded the particular exposure of state occasions in which thousands waited in silence for syllables that might not come cleanly. His father, George V, had watched both sons for years and had formed his own assessment of what the future held. His reported verdict on the heir: "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. Wasn't optimism. His reported prayer that Nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne. Wasn't a blessing for the Yorks, so much as a warning about Edward. Both were recorded before the abdication crisis began. In December 1936, both proved accurate in ways that destroyed the quiet life at 145 Piccadilly. Wallis Warfield was born in Baltimore, Maryland, in 1896. She had been married twice before Edward came to dominate her life. First, to a U.S. Navy pilot named Win Spencer, a marriage that ended in divorce in 1927, after years of his alcoholism and violence. Then to British shipping executive Ernest Simpson, a quiet and steady man who gave her social position and London company. She wasn't conventionally beautiful. She described herself as not beautiful, but not plain. And the physical description that follows her through history is notably unflattering. Sharp jawline, prominent nose, a figure described by one fashion writer as slight and somewhat severe. Anne Seba, whose biography, That Woman, is the most serious attempt to understand her from the inside, rejects the seductress caricature and offers instead a woman of quick intelligence, social gift, and a capacity for concentrated personal attention that drew people towards her. Philip Ziegler, writing for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, put it directly. Her quick wits, vitality, and capacity for total concentration on her interlocutor ensured that she had many admirers. What she had with Edward is harder to characterize, and the historical record is genuinely divided. They became lovers by 1934. By 1936, when Edward had inherited the throne and Wallis was appearing in the court circular, while her husband Ernest's name was conspicuously absent, the relationship had become the consuming fact of his existence. Ziegler himself, as Edward's official biographer, wrote, "There must have been some sort of sadomasochistic relationship. Edward relished the contempt and bullying she bestowed on him." That asymmetry, his need greater than hers, his devotion more fixed and more public, would matter enormously when the crisis arrived. The public alarm began in earnest in the summer of 1936. Edward hired the steam yacht Nolan and sailed down the Dalmatian coast with Wallis and a party of guests. The British press maintained a self-imposed silence on the affair. Continental and American papers didn't. Expatriate Britons and Canadians were reading, weeks before their domestic press admitted the story existed, detailed accounts of the king's happiness on a yacht in the Adriatic with a twice-married American woman, photographs of them on deck, ashore in Greek ports, at dinners in the company of European socialites who understood perfectly what they were witnessing. Alec Hardinge, the king's private secretary, wrote to Edward on 13 November 1936, warning that the silence isn't going to be maintained, and that when it broke, the effect will be calamitous. Stanley Baldwin told him plainly on 16 November that the marriage wouldn't be acceptable to the people. The prime ministers of Australia, Canada, and South Africa consulted directly, rejected every option except abdication. What tends to be lost in this account is Wallis's own interior experience of it. Private correspondence, subsequently examined by biographers, describes something considerably less triumphant than the public narrative. As the crisis built, Wallis was writing doubting letters to her Aunt Bessie Merriman, letters that registered fear and confusion, and a woman who felt caught inside an obsession she had not designed and couldn't fully halt, rather than one who had engineered it. The abdication was Edward's act, driven by Edward's need, executed over Wallis's expressed doubts. She had tried to withdraw from the relationship. He had answered each expression of doubt by choosing her again, more publicly, more irreversibly. "I shall never give you up," he told her at a tearful departure in early December 1936, as she left for the south of France to escape the press. The crisis was his. The consequences were everyone else's. On 10 December 1936, Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere, his house in Windsor Great Park. The room was private. His 3 brothers, Albert, Henry, and George, were present to witness it. The document runs to 11 sentences. It's a renunciation of the crown, of all hereditary claims, of everything, in favor of a woman who had written to her aunt that she felt caught beside the grave of the life she had known. Albert's record of the days immediately surrounding that moment is in his diary. The evening before the signature, he went to London to see his mother, Queen Mary, at Marlborough House. He needed to tell her what was happening. "When I told her what had happened," he wrote, "I broke down and sobbed like a child." His authorized biographer would later describe his assumption of the throne as a task from which he had recoiled. These aren't phrases from the vocabulary of political calculation. They belong to someone undone by what was being asked of him. A man who had spent years managing a stammer that was itself a symptom of the anxiety that the request to be king was about to scale to national dimensions. On the evening of 11 December 1936, Edward broadcast his abdication speech to the nation from Windsor Castle. He had begun his reign 325 days earlier, the shortest reign in over 450 years. The broadcast was heard by millions. In it, he explained that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. Bertie, now George VI, heard it like everyone else. He was 41 years old. Elizabeth had written to Queen Mary in November 1936, twice, within days of each other, describing her shock at the unfolding crisis. On 6 December, she wrote again to her friend, May Elphinstone, thanking her for support, which meant so much. These letters are thin testimony compared to what the crisis meant in practice, but they are evidence of a woman reaching outward for help, while the life she had built came apart. At 145 Piccadilly, there had been a household, a domestic order, a marriage shaped around the particular capacities and incapacities of a man who needed consistency and a wife who could manage what he couldn't. That household was now, by an act committed elsewhere, for reasons that Elizabeth couldn't override and had not been consulted about, responsible for the British monarchy. The scale of the new obligation bore no resemblance to the old one. The girls, who had been growing up as the daughters of a royal duke, were suddenly the first and second in line to a throne their father had never expected and couldn't refuse. Princess Elizabeth was 10 years old. Margaret was 6. The coronation was set for 12 May 1937 at Westminster Abbey. The date had been arranged for Edward. George VI kept it, arriving in his brother's place. Elizabeth was crowned queen consort in the same ceremony, seated beside Bertie in a church of extraordinary formal weight, watching her husband receive what had been done to him, wearing the crown she had not sought and couldn't return. Within 16 days of that coronation, letters patent were issued under the new king's authority, denying Wallis Simpson, upon her marriage to the Duke of Windsor, the style of Her Royal Highness. She would be a duchess, not a royal one. The document was dated 28 May 1937, issued in the same month as the crowning. Among the very first acts of the reign. Historians are careful about attributing the HRH denial solely to the Queen Mother's influence. The letters patent were the king's to issue, and the legal argument for the restriction, that Edward had surrendered his royal status upon abdication and couldn't automatically extend it to a future wife, had some constitutional foundation. The Queen Mother's precise institutional role in the decision is contested. The Duke of Windsor believed she had personally engineered it and would say so openly to Michael Thornton, a journalist who spent time with both parties at separate intervals over several years. The Duchess believed it too, with considerable vehemence. What the record confirms is simpler and sufficient. The exclusion happened, was formal and permanent, and established the framework within which the next 5 decades would operate. On 3 June 1937, Edward married Wallis at the Château de Condé in the Touraine region of France. No member of the British royal family attended. The family's position had been stated and wouldn't be revisited. Elizabeth's position was also stated, in the terms that mattered most. She was queen. The life at 145 Piccadilly was replaced by Buckingham Palace, by the formal machinery of state, by the continuous exposure of a role that had been someone else's until Edward had made it hers. The woman who had twice declined to join the royal family because she feared what it would cost her in personal freedom was now operating at the center of it, with no way out. Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939. George VI and Elizabeth stayed in London. They could have relocated. The children were sent to Windsor Castle for safety, and there were those who pressed the case for the king and queen to do the same. They refused. Instead, they remained in the city, driving through the smoke and rubble, standing in the gaps where houses had been the week before, visiting hospital wards where the bombing had deposited its victims. The Blitz began in September 1940. On the morning of 7th September, 348 German bombers attacked London in daylight, and then 255 more came at night. The fires were visible from 30 miles away. Over the following weeks, the raids became nightly. The East End took the worst of it. Terraced streets in Stepney, Bethnal Green, Poplar, reduced to brick and timber, and the smell of gas from fractured pipes. Families sheltered in the underground stations, on platforms and in corridors, sleeping in rows. The images were photographed and distributed as evidence of civilian endurance. They were also evidence of class. The East End was burning while wealthier districts remained relatively intact, and the political optics of that disparity weren't lost on anyone. On 13 September 1940, Buckingham Palace was seriously bombed, while both the king and queen were in the courtyard. The palace had been hit before, but this was the most direct and most witnessed incident. Bombs falling close enough to shatter windows across the building and send debris across the forecourt where they were standing. After it, Elizabeth was widely quoted as saying, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The line is attributed across multiple contemporary accounts and is consistent with everything she did publicly throughout the war. The message was identical to the act, that the Crown shared the city's exposure rather than being protected from it. Newsreel footage from the period confirms the pattern in relentless detail. One 1940 caption reads, "Day after day, the Queen is visiting the wounded, bringing good cheer and renewed hope. Hospital after hospital, bombed site after bombed site. The same composed and particular presence applied to scenes of genuine destruction." She learned the names of people she met on these tours, asked questions about their families, remembered details from previous visits. The performance was total. Hitler reportedly described her as the most dangerous woman in Europe, a characterization whose exact documentary provenance is uncertain, but which captures how her wartime presence functioned. She wasn't a passive consort. She had become a moral institution in herself, one the German propaganda apparatus identified correctly as a problem. All of this was the consequence of a decision she had not made, in a room she had not been in, involving a woman she had already identified as her enemy before the crisis broke. Elizabeth had not sought the role, had twice refused the quieter version of it, and was now performing it for a nation in existential crisis. Meanwhile, Bertie, who still needed Lionel Logue's preparation for every significant broadcast, who still managed a stammer that had defined him since childhood, who was, in the assessment of every biographer who studied him, genuinely unsuited by temperament to the scale of what the war demanded, was being asked to embody the nation's resolution at the worst moment in its modern history. He sat with Logue in the broadcasting room at Buckingham Palace. He went through the words. He delivered the speeches. He didn't fail. But the effort required to not fail was entirely different from the effort required of a man who had been prepared for this from birth. George VI was a heavy smoker. The medical record on this point is unambiguous. He had smoked heavily for most of his adult life, reportedly from around the age of 16, and the toll was visible to his doctors long before the formal diagnosis arrived. By 1948, he had been diagnosed with arteriosclerosis, peripheral vascular disease, causing severe pain in his right leg during exertion, with early discussions among his physicians about the possibility of amputation. Surgery in March 1949 addressed the immediate crisis, and a period of recovery followed. But the underlying deterioration didn't reverse. In May 1951, a shadow appeared on his lung during a medical examination. Consultations followed through the summer. In September, surgeons performed a left total pneumonectomy at Buckingham Palace, the complete removal of his left lung. Sir Clement Price Thomas carried out the operation. The bulletin posted on the palace gates described the procedure as addressing structural changes in the lung that were giving cause for concern. The word carcinoma didn't appear. The diagnosis had been withheld from the public, from the wider medical profession, and, in the practice of the era, from the king himself. A peer-reviewed reassessment published in the journal Cardiovascular Pathology in 2021 assessed the case directly. The king, a heavy smoker, underwent a left total pneumonectomy in September 1951 for what euphemistically was called structural abnormalities of his left lung, but what in reality was a carcinoma. Continued hemoptysis, blood in the sputum, after the surgery indicated the cancer had spread to the right lung. He appeared in public to be recovering. He resumed limited official duties through the autumn. Palace bulletins described excellent progress. On the 31st of January 1952, he was photographed at an airport, standing in the cold, waving. It's the last confirmed photograph of him alive. He had been in good enough spirits that day to remain on the tarmac to see the plane carrying Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip depart for what was supposed to be a Commonwealth tour. He watched the plane go until it was out of sight. Then he returned to Sandringham. 6 days later, on the morning of the 6th of February 1952, his valet, Alistair Scott, entered the bedroom at Sandringham House at around 7:30 in the morning to wake him. The tea on the bedside table had not been touched. The king had died during the night, quietly, in his sleep, without apparent distress. He was 56 years old. The official cause announced to the nation was coronary thrombosis. The 2021 medical reassessment suggests the terminal event may have been a pulmonary embolus or a massive intrathoracic hemorrhage, a complication of the cancer that had spread from the removed lung to the right. These remain, at this distance, reconstructions rather than certainties. What is certain is the age, 56. His father, George V, had died at 70. The gap between those two numbers was 14 years. The Queen Mother wasn't at Sandringham when he died. She had remained in London, at Royal Lodge, following what had become their habit of occasional separate travel. She was informed privately that morning, before any public announcement was made, and traveled north to Sandringham afterwards. She was 51 years old. She would live for another 50 years until March 2002, and would maintain something close to mourning dress for virtually the entire duration. The black clothes became a kind of statement. Widowhood wasn't a circumstance she was passing through. It was the frame she placed around everything that came after. A few weeks after the funeral, she wrote to Lionel Logue, who was then in his early 70s and had less than a year to live. The letter survives in the Logue archive. "During all those years, you were a tower of strength to him," she wrote, "and he has often told me how much he is owed to you, and the excellent result could never have been achieved if it had not been for your help." She was thanking the man who had spent 26 years managing the stammer that had defined Bertie since childhood, the stammer that had been present at every speech, every broadcast, every moment of public exposure the Crown demanded of a man who had never been prepared for its weight. This was the private texture of the marriage the abdication had forced into public. She was acknowledging it to the one person who had been present for it professionally, because there was no other appropriate register. The academic record of her position on the cause of his death is precise in its formulation. Multiple biographers have documented that she blamed Wallis Simpson for the abdication and held her at least partly responsible for George VI's premature death. And the parenthetical that follows in the biographical literature is equally precise, even though he died of lung cancer. The distinction matters enormously. She wasn't making a medical argument. She was making an emotional one, assembling a chain of consequence that moved from one woman's hold on one weak king to the death of her husband at a far younger age than his father had reached. The chain is coherent as emotional logic. It does not require the cigarettes to disappear or the cancer to be someone else's fault. It requires only that the crown was something Bertie had never wanted, had never been suited to, and had carried anyway because of his brother's abdication, and that the war, which the crown demanded of him, had exacted a toll on a constitution already fragile. Whether those years shortened what might otherwise have been a longer life can't be proved or disproved by the medical record, but Elizabeth believed it. Every biographer who has studied her closely concludes she believed it. The blame required a human address, and Wallis was available. In July 1940, the Duke of Windsor was appointed Governor of the Bahamas. He and Wallis arrived in Nassau on 18 August. The posting had legitimate security dimensions. German intelligence, through what became known as Operation Willy, had been actively assessing whether the Duke could be used as a figurehead if a German invasion succeeded. Keeping him away from Europe was sensible as well as convenient. But it had the character of exile, and the Duke experienced it precisely that way. He served as governor until 1945, presiding over a colonial administration at the outermost edge of relevance, while the war his brother was symbolizing from bomb-damaged London was fought without him. The Queen Mother had, in fact, written to Lord Lloyd at the Colonial Office to oppose the Bahamas appointment, describing the Duchess as the lowest of the low and arguing against it. The irony is complete. She opposed the posting the Duke later blamed her for forcing upon him. Both parties in this dispute were misreading the institutional mechanics, but the Duke's conviction that his sister-in-law had engineered his exile was unshakable, and he held it for the rest of his life. The letters patent of May 1937 remain the clearest legal trace of the exclusion's permanence. Michael Bloch, who worked for the Duke's Parisian lawyer Maître Suzanne Blum from 1979 onward, and had access to the Windsor papers, documented the Duke's sustained efforts over decades to have the HRH style extended to Wallis. He wrote letters. He raised the subject through intermediaries. He appealed to sentiment and to law. Nothing moved. The correspondence survived. The concession never arrived. At family events over the subsequent decades, the pattern held. The Duke attended Queen Mary's funeral in March 1953. He had been at Marlborough House when she died, had visited her 3 times in her final days. Whether the Duchess attended that funeral isn't confirmed in the surviving record. For each occasion, the arrangement was the same. calibrated to a minimum, managed to avoid the question of how Wallis should be placed and greeted and seen. In 1967, at the unveiling of a plaque in the Mall to Queen Mary, the two women came face to face for the first time in over 3 decades. Cameras recorded a long and visibly uncomfortable handshake. Wallis didn't curtsy to a crowned and anointed queen. When the Duke died in Paris in May 1972, Wallis traveled to England. She stayed at Buckingham Palace at the Queen's invitation, already frail, already in the early stages of the arteriosclerosis that would eventually take her speech and her memory entirely. At the funeral, Michael Thornton, who had met both women on separate occasions over several years, observed the Queen Mother take Wallis by the arm, speak briefly to her, and kiss her on the cheek when she departed. Courtiers, according to Thornton, were astonished. One reason the grudge required such active maintenance was that Wallis refused to disappear. She didn't retreat into obscurity or the penitential quiet the palace might have preferred. She and Edward built a life in Paris, a mansion at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the Bois de Boulogne, a country house at Le Moulin de la Tuileries that was vivid, photographed, and continuously covered by the international press across 3 decades. By the end of 1938, Wallis had appeared in Vogue half a dozen times, documented in detail by fashion editors who had made her their subject. She bought 8 dresses in a single session at Montboucher, rounded padded sleeves in the day dresses, sleeveless evening gowns, colors restricted to white, black, red, and blue, shoes polished to a shine on every surface, including the underside and the inside of the heel. One fashion writer noted that she bought the same style of shoe in multiple colors, and another documented her rule that nothing she wore should be toeless or heelless. Her exactitude was total and documented to a degree unusual even for a public figure. Her wedding dress, a bias-cut pale blue Montboucher specifically dyed to match the interior of the Château de Condé, generated a shade known afterwards as Wallis Blue that appeared in department stores across the United States within 2 weeks of the wedding. She understood what she was doing. Elsa Maxwell, the gossip columnist who knew her throughout her life, recorded Wallis's own reasoning. "My husband gave up everything for me. If everyone looks at me when I enter a room, he can feel proud of me. That's my chief responsibility." She had been handed a role she had not auditioned for and had decided to perform it completely. Every appearance was an argument. Every Vogue cover was a counter-narrative to the verdict that she was a disqualification. James Pope Hennessy, visiting the Windsors at Le Moulin de la Tuileries in 1958, while researching the authorized biography of Queen Mary, noted something specific about the Duchess when Elizabeth's name was raised. A facial contortion, reserved for speaking of the Queen Mother, which is very unpleasant to behold and seemed to me akin to frenzy. The frenzy had a mirror. When Michael Thornton sat in the Bois de Boulogne drawing room in 1971, a room of blue and gold, portraits, heavy curtains, the managed formality of people who had been living as if in an embassy for 30 years, the Duke was months away from a diagnosis of inoperable throat cancer. He offered his characterization of his sister-in-law with a charming smile. "Behind that great abundance of charm," he said, "is a shrewd, scheming, and extremely ruthless woman." Then, but of course you can't quote that. Wallis imposed no such restriction. When Thornton asked her why the Queen Mother had maintained their exclusion for so long, the Duchess extended her arm, Thornton recalled, as if taking aim with a gun. "Jealousy," she said. "Jealousy of me for having married him." The Windsors had spent decades constructing a narrative in which Elizabeth's enmity derived from her own desire to have married Edward herself. The historian Andrew Roberts has stated flatly that no serious historian accepts this account. It has the character of the only explanation the Windsors could live with, one that cast their exclusion as the product of passion rather than considered policy, of one woman's failure to get what she wanted rather than a dynasty's response to what they represented. The account collapses under scrutiny, but it captures something structurally true. The Queen Mother's enmity had a personal core. The evidentiary record of the Queen Mother's feelings divides into layers that require handling with care. The public layer is the pattern of exclusion, the HRH denial, the Bahamas posting, the management of family events to minimize Wallis's presence, the coffin bearing its silver plaque in 1986 without the royal prefix after 49 years of marriage. These are traceable in official documents and in the accounts of those who observed the court's operations over decades. Biographer Ingrid Seward summarized the aggregate plainly. The Queen's attitude to the Windsors bordered on a vendetta. The private layer is more fragmentary. The epithet most associated with Elizabeth's feelings, that woman, is so thoroughly attributed to her that Anne Seba chose it as the title of her Wallis biography. Whether she used that precise phrase isn't confirmed with archival certainty. It's traditional, rather than documented at the primary level. A more inflammatory remark, sometimes attributed to her, placing Wallis alongside Hitler as the two causes of greatest difficulty in her life, circulates widely in popular accounts but lacks a reliably sourced primary attribution. What does have sourcing is the behavior and the recorded speech. Michael Thornton's accounts, from his appearances at Clarence House and at the Eaton Square luncheons, and from his sessions with the Windsors in Paris, constitute the most sustained documented witness record of what both women actually said when the subject arose. He described the overall pattern as the steely and implacable ostracism practiced for 50 years by the late Queen Mother against her despised and twice-divorced American sister-in-law. This is characterization rather than transcript, but it synthesizes 3 decades of first-hand observation. There is a harder quality to what little she said on record. When Thornton raised the suggestion, at one of their meetings, that she had been responsible for the Windsors' exile, the Queen Mother smiled and replied almost absently, "A country can only have one king at a time." The remark ends the conversation and contains the verdict. The syntax is elegant and cold. Not a grievance, not an explanation, not a defense. An axiom, delivered by someone who had made a decision and found it required no further justification. The screenplay writer David Seidler, who spent years researching George VI before writing The King's Speech, had contacted the Queen Mother for access to Logue's materials in the early 1980s. She asked him not to proceed in her lifetime. "The memory of these events is too painful," came the message from Clarence House. She didn't die until March 2002 at the age of 101. The memories were too painful for 20 years of requests, but the subject itself wasn't avoided. At the right tables, with the right people, it produced impressions and anecdotes, and the particular pleasure of a woman who had decided long ago how she felt and saw no reason to revise it. Wallis died on 24th of April, 1986, at her house in Paris. The final years had been years of dissolution. Arteriosclerosis had taken her speech by 1980. Dementia had arrived gradually through the same period. Her fingers had become so malformed by arthritis that her wedding ring could no longer fit them. She spent her last years in bed, without visitors except for doctors and nurses, tended by a household that reported to her eccentric French lawyer, Maître Suzanne Blum. Her friend Diana, Lady Moseley, on hearing of the death, said, "It wasn't really a life at all. I'm delighted to hear she has died. I wish she'd died many years ago." The comment is merciless, but it registers the scale of the decline. Her estate, valued at approximately £5 million, went to the Pasteur Institute in tribute to France, which had provided her a home for nearly 50 years. The royal family received no significant bequest. Her body was flown to England by the Queen's flight, and a private service of 28 minutes was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, attended by 175 mourners, including the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen Mother, and the Prince and Princess of Wales. There were no eulogies. The service contained no direct references to the Duchess. The Canon of Westminster referred to her once in a prayer as "our sister." The silver plaque on her coffin read, "Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, 1896 to 1986. No HRH prefix." The prefix does not appear on her gravestone either. The Queen Mother was present in the chapel. She wasn't present at the gravesite. On the advice of Queen Elizabeth II, she didn't attend the burial. In 1976, 10 years before the death, the Queen Mother had made an official trip to Paris, and a visit to the ailing Duchess had been tentatively arranged. It never happened. Wallis's doctor advised the Queen Mother's staff that she was suffering from dementia and paranoid hallucinations, and ought not to receive the visit. From the British Embassy, Elizabeth dispatched her page with a basket of roses and a card written in her own hand. It read, "In friendship, Elizabeth." Whether this represented a genuine softening or the residue of protocol observed across an unbridgeable distance isn't something the record settles. The Queen Mother didn't hate Wallis because Wallis stole a crown. That was the public version, the one that made the enmity legible as principle, the institutional defender of the monarchy against the unsuitable American divorcee. It had a respectable shape. It could be explained in formal terms. The deeper wound was that Wallis handed the crown to Bertie. She turned a private husband into a public king, a nervous father into a national symbol, a reluctant duchess into the woman who would spend the rest of her life defending a monarchy she had never sought and could never escape. None of this was Wallis's stated intention. Her private correspondence from 1936 makes clear she was sending doubtful letters to her aunt about the situation, that she had tried to discourage the abdication. But intention and consequence operate in different registers, and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was working entirely in the register of consequence. Bertie had died at 56. His left lung had been removed in September 1951 for a carcinoma the palace described as structural abnormalities. He had smoked heavily for decades, and the cancer was the lung's answer to the smoking. But he had also stood in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace when the bombs fell, driven through the rubble of the East End, delivered wartime speeches in a BBC broadcasting room with Lionel Logue conducting him through the difficult syllables, carried the full constitutional weight of a role he had never been prepared for and had never wanted, sustained through years of unrelenting public demand that gave his anxiety no quarter. Elizabeth had watched all of it. She had helped carry all of it, from the quiet rooms of 145 Piccadilly, to the palace balcony, to the East End visits, to the letter she wrote to his speech therapist in the weeks after his death. Wallis, meanwhile, had lived in Paris. There had been dinner parties and main-bochet gowns and photographs in vogue, and a social existence that was, across 3 decades, more written about and more photographed than almost any other in Europe. She had survived glamorously and continuously, in something that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the kind of life Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had twice declined the royal connection to avoid. Self-directed, free from the machinery of state, conducted on her own terms. Whether that constituted guilt in any moral sense isn't a question the evidence settles. The Queen Mother wasn't constructing a moral argument. She was recording a cost, and assigning it to the nearest available address. Every ceremony was a reminder. Every public appearance was the visible consequence of a choice she had not made. The grudge became policy because policy was the only instrument available to someone in her position. She couldn't undo the abdication. She couldn't restore 145 Piccadilly. She couldn't give Bertie back the 56 quiet years he had not been permitted to have. What she could do was maintain the exclusion, formally, consistently, for 50 years. And she did. Forgiveness wasn't structurally possible, not because Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was vindictive, not because Wallis Simpson was monstrous, but because the architecture of the grievance left no room for it. The Queen Mother had spent 50 years inside the consequence of someone else's act. That tends not to produce forgiveness. It produces exactly what it produced: a steely, implacable, permanent exclusion, maintained until one of them was in the ground, and just a little beyond that. If stories like this are what you come here for, subscribing means you'll see them when they arrive.